Okay, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion on the impact of social media on society. This discussion is also the last part of our final meeting of the ODYCCEUS project that took place over the last 3 days. My name is Eckhard Olbrich. I'm a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Mathematics in the Sciences in Leipzig, and I'm the coordinator of this ODYCCEUS project. And the ODYCCEUS stands, this acronym stands for Opinion Dynamics and Cultural Conflicts in European Spaces. And it is a European research project with 8 partners from 6 European countries that has over the last 4 years addressed several questions on the far-reaching effects of social media and digitalization on public discourse. One particular goal of this project was to build tools to be able to deal with the increasing amount of communication that happens in the public sphere due to the digitalization, and by somehow allowing to automatize parts of reading, so to say, messages and other things, because today no one is able really to read all the things that are written on social media. So one can, for instance, read the comments under one YouTube video on some topic, but definitely not on all the videos that appear on a certain topic. And the same happens with articles, online comments, or with replies to tweets and so on. And so the goal of the project was to build methods, theories, and tools to deal with this new situation. And now this discussion is at the very end of the project, and it is somehow the purpose of it is somehow to widen the view and also to reflect a bit about what is the impact of what we are doing, what is the impact of the phenomenon that we are studying, and what is our own role in it. And in order to discuss that, I'm glad that I can welcome 3 experts on this topic. This is first Julia Ebner. She is a researcher on radicalization at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue in London, and currently is doing her PhD on online radicalization at the Institute of Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology at the University of Oxford. She has authored 2 best-selling books, The Rage, The Vicious Circle of Islamist and Far-Right Extremism in 2017, and her second book, Going Dark, The Sacred Social Lives of Extremists in 2019, which has the German title Radikalisierungsmaschinen, which also inspired, so to say, the title of this event. Also, I think she used it in a bit different way as we used it in our title. She also regularly writes for newspapers like The Guardian, The Independent, or The Washington Post, and started recently a column in the Austrian weekly newspaper Falter. Welcome, Julia.
Hello, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and hello, everyone. Yeah, I would like to start by giving you an overview.
I just wanted to introduce all the other speakers first.
Sorry, I know.
Sorry.
Green light for the presentation. I will.
Yeah. Sorry. Our second panelist is Andreas Jungherr. He is professor for political science at the University of Bamberg and has there the chair for the governance of complex and innovative technological systems. And this already indicates one of his main interests, the effect of technological change on society. And in our context, in particular, the role of social media in political discourse. He is also author of the book Analyzing Political Communication with Digital Trace Data, about using Twitter in social science research, which was also a good resource for us as coming, so to say, from the outside to entering the field in Leipzig in the ODYCCEUS group. And more recently, he wrote the book Retooling Politics, How Digital Media Are Shaping Society, which is exactly spot on the topic that we want to discuss this evening. Welcome, Andreas.
Yeah,
and finally, I want to welcome Philipp Lorenz-Spreen. He is a researcher at the Adaptive Rationality Behavior Department of the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin and studies online behavior. not least with the aim to improve our use of social media. Originally, he studied physics, but did already his PhD on models for the dynamics of collective attention. And he is also the co-author of the report on the European Commission on understanding the influence of online technologies on political behavior and decision-making. Welcome, Philipp. The structure of the evening will be the following. In a moment, Julia will start with her introductory impulse, and then there will be reactions and statements from Philipp and Andreas. After that, we will enter the panel discussion for around half an hour, and after that, we will open then the discussion for questions from the audience. So the participants of the conference that are on Zoom, they can use the Zoom chat for posing the questions, or the audience on YouTube, please ask your questions by using Twitter and using the hashtag ODYCCEUS21. As it's also, you see it on the webpage, but please use the spelling as you see it in my background. So with the 2 C's. I will also repeat this later. So now it's part for Julia. Please start your talk.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was so excited to get started with the discussion and everything that I jumped ahead. But yeah, I will first give you a brief overview of my latest research, both based on the books that I've authored, but also on some of the current emerging trends that we can see in radicalization, online radicalization, and online polarization. And I really look forward to a discussion then, and to hopefully many comments and questions. I will start by sharing my screen with you because I've prepared a few slides. So I will do that now. Hopefully this is visible now to everyone. Yeah, as I briefly mentioned, most of what I'm going to be sharing is based both on the research that I did for my latest book, Going Dark, or Radikalisierungsmaschinen in German, and also on the research that I'm currently doing in Oxford, but also for the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. So for my book, I took a rather, I would say, unconventional approach, which wouldn't work at Oxford University or at most other universities, I imagine, because I went undercover with a range of different online extremist groups. I also partly joined them offline. But more interesting for this, I think, is what I encountered in these online extremist channels and groups. And I went undercover with jihadist groups like ISIS hacker groups, but also misogynist communities, far-right extremists, and neo-Nazi groups, and also conspiracy theorists. And what was interesting in terms of what I found there was that there was always a pattern that this online radicalization process, in whatever the ideological direction, there was always a pattern that this process followed. And it, of course, started always with recruiting. Then it went into socialization. And I think for this, really, this project is really highly interesting, because studying the social lives of extremists, studying their language and how they almost become a subculture, sometimes a hip and trendy subculture that can attract young people, is, I believe, really important. And here, linguistic analysis or narrative analysis can really help to further our understanding in this. Then often they also carry out communication campaigns that then reach a more mainstream audience and further polarize our societies. Again, I think this is really helpful to get more and more analysis and more research done in this area. And then, of course, we often see also this manifest itself in offline mobilization to protests or even attacks in the last step. This doesn't always occur, of course, but unfortunately, we've seen more and more attacks in recent years. And just looking at the latest trends in the last year or year and a half since COVID emerged, we've really seen what the WHO called an infodemic. So really the rapid spread of disinformation and conspiracy theories. In the UK, 1 in 4 Britons now believe in the conspiracy theory of QAnon. I will go into details in a second about this. And the United Nations also spoke of a tsunami of hate that we're seeing. So really a spread in, or a massive surge in anti-minority hatred, anti-Semitic, but also anti-Muslim, anti-migrant hatred that we saw rise even further against the backdrop of the crisis, of the current crisis. And then unfortunately also more and more extremist groups, and same goes for just not extremist groups, but hyper-polarized online communities have really tried to make use of this crisis to recruit new members and to reach new audiences. And one example is the QAnon, the conspiracy theory community QAnon, which I joined as part of my book research in fringe community that was mainly focused on US politics with maybe tens of thousands of members. And now we have seen a global spread of this community and a global expansion where they have reached millions of followers. So this has really impacted even politics to the extent that in the US, some Congress candidates last year were supporting QAnon, and also in Europe, we see more and more politicians share some of the hashtags and some of the code words of QAnon. So again, this is something where there's an increasing polarization, and where I would say that a narrative analysis or linguistic analysis using, for example, also the keywords of QAnon is really highly needed to understand the full extent of this, and also who is most vulnerable to being recruited into those conspiracy theory networks. This has also manifested itself in the real world, as we could see in many headlines recently. We have seen attacks on 5G, because some of the most absurd conspiracy theories is that that actually coronavirus is caused by the 5G telephone masts. So there were lots of attacks on those. That's just vandalism, one could say. But there were also attacks on journalists more and more, also in Germany. And of course, we saw even attacks on democratic institutions. We saw the storming of the Reichstag in Germany, but also the storming of the Michigan Capitol, and most lately also of the US Capitol in Washington, DC, which was all linked to disinformation and all linked to conspiracy theories that emerged in the online spaces. I also want to direct your attention to another kind of dynamic that we've been observing over the past year, the rise in hate crimes, both online and offline. There was really a strong surge in anti-Semitic narratives or anti-Semitic content online, and also offline assaults, both on Jews, but also on other minorities, in particular also Asian minorities, where lots of conspiracy theories are, of course, going against the Chinese people, and are really advancing this hatred against minorities, ethnic minorities, but also sometimes against migrants in general, or Muslim migrants in particular. And there were several reports that showed the extent of anti-Semitism. For example, the CST in the UK reported that there were almost 800 anti-Semitic incidents across the UK in just the first half of the year of the coronavirus, the year 2020. And there were a lot of attempts to also weaponize corona against migrants, where this spread actually in the online sphere. And we need a lot more support for the security services to predict attacks, of course, on minority communities, on refugee camps, on religious institutions, because this was just one instance, but there were several far-right extremist groups that talked about actually spreading salvia on the door handles of synagogues or of refugee camps in order to pass on coronavirus to these minorities. Another dynamic or another trend that we're seeing is that the international far right is becoming increasingly global, and is really a loose network of individuals across the world who share the lowest common denominator, a common enemy, but also share increasingly the same language, the same insider jokes and insider vocabulary, which is helpful when it comes to online analysis, because it means that we can often really determine their vocabulary, which is constantly changing, but can really narrow it down to words that are used as code words. Sometimes also not for them not to be taken offline by the big platforms. They invent their own language, their own linguistic terms that are circumventing the current legislation. And this is just an example of the locations of different neo-Nazis who made use of the platform Iron March. which was leaked and is now available for research as well. And another trend is that more and more women are also joining into these far-right extremist communities. In general, I would say that this is also true was also true for the jihadist space, or is still true, where ISIS and other groups have increasingly moved to the online sphere and would want to carry out what they call a cyber jihad, and have really recruited more and more women as well into their ranks. And the same is true for neo-Nazi groups and far-right communities. At the same time, paradoxically, there's also, however, a rise in misogyny and misogynist crimes, in particular, misogynist terror attacks, especially among the global far right, where an increasing number of attacks were targeting women and were targeting feminists. And this is also very visible in the online space with the manosphere, the so-called manosphere, giving rise to several different misogynist subcultures. And again, they have a lot of crossover with the conspiracy theory communities, with the traditional racist far-right communities, and also with the gaming. There's an overlap with the gaming community. There are even some female anti-feminist communities, which were really a shock of this phenomenon until I went undercover with these female misogynists and saw that they're not just, in some of the cases, just spreading very conservative family ideas, very anti-feminist ideas, but sometimes even endorsing domestic violence against women and endorsing some of the wider misogynist narratives that are also playing a role in the radicalization towards violence against women. Then one of the last, what I find most shocking trends is that the online recruitment campaigns and also online communication campaigns are increasingly gamified. ISIS and the jihadist groups already made use of gamification and video game-like propaganda in order to lure in young individuals into their networks. But now the far right has reinvented this and is really very effectively making use of memes, of visual content, where they sometimes camouflage their own radical ideologies behind jokes or funny looking memes. And they even have sometimes published something like the Generation Identity, the white nationalist movement, an information war manual, where they gamify the act of spreading disinformation, of carrying out harassment campaigns and hate campaigns against political opponents. So they would, for example, call for a sniper mission against a journalist that they don't like, or against a politician that they disagree with. And you can then move up in the different ranks. So they set up hierarchies, just like in a video game. You can be promoted into higher ranks if you do a particularly good job at this. This is a really, I would say, scary dynamic, because this meant that we saw a lot of young people, sometimes even minors, joining these communities, these trolling armies, just for the sake of having fun or for the entertainment factor, not really because they were interested in the ideologies in the first place. And unfortunately, this, in the continuation of this trend, we also observed more and more terrorist attacks that followed this pattern, where even the act of the terror attack itself was gamified. The Christchurch shooter who carried out the attack at the 2 mosques in New Zealand in 2019 and killed over 50 Muslims, he was one of the first ones to use this tactic. So he really shot his, or live streamed his attack to his own video game, far-right video game audience, and filmed it from a first-person ego shooter angle, and also used very much this insider vocabulary that is common in these far-right online communities to appeal to particularly to this audience. And then there were several attacks that followed exactly the same pattern, with, of course, one of the most prominent cases being the Halle attacker, who really also made use of gaming language in his so-called manifesto, and even drafted a list of achievements where he gave points to different targets that he would kill, and also used a 3D printer to print his own weapons. And this is also in reference to some of the video game communities who would call that weapons crafting. I'm of course not saying that the whole video game community is at risk of radicalization, but there's certainly an overlap in the language that is being used and an attempt to instrumentalize or exploit those communities. So we're seeing a new form of copycat terrorism, and that's gamified terrorism. And this is, one of the last, I think, concerning trends. Looking at the future, this means that there's more and more a competition for higher scores among individuals who are already radicalized into those online communities, where the goal is to beat Anders Breivik, the Norwegian terrorist. And the idea is to get as many scores as possible, or as many points as possible. So this is a very dangerous dynamic that we don't yet understand in its full extent, and where I would say, again, it's really much needed to have a better understanding of, or a better analysis in these also hidden forums on the internet. Speaking of hidden forums and websites, there's a whole emerging alternative digital safe haven or an alternative internet that the far right and other extremists now use for their own purposes, because a lot of the more mainstream and bigger platforms like Facebook and Twitter and also YouTube have, of course, removed extremist content more and more, at least to some extent in the last few years, and have gotten better at removing disinformation and conspiracy theories. Doesn't mean that everything is offline now, but it has been a start. And it also meant that a lot of the extremists now moved and migrated to different platforms, sometimes even founded their own far-right Twitter equivalent or their own far-right YouTube equivalent, such as BitChute. Here you can see a number of examples. You even have alternative dating platforms for whites only. And this is really, this is a whole universe in itself that one can explore. I would certainly not recommend going on the online alternative dating platforms. It's very disturbing what you find there. But and the last dynamic, again, where we see a potential threat also for the offline world, for the real world, is that there are now also increasingly do-it-yourself manuals and bomb making instruction manuals or weapons crafting manuals that are being shared online. And we're doing our best to flagging these to the authorities so that they can be taken offline very quickly. But this is, again, something that is, I think, really, really important here also to support the security services in, for example, detecting and monitoring the emergence of such manuals. And this could also be done through analyzing language and even analyzing comments made by people underneath YouTube videos, because sometimes you find these links in surprising places. So I'm very excited and to hear more also about the project and discuss its potential. I think overall, the solutions can then be summarized into, we need more prevention. We, first of all, need, of course, better analysis, better understanding of what we're actually dealing with. But then we also need really more initiatives that target young people, but also digital natives, the older generations, who are sometimes falling prey to conspiracy theories. For example, the average age in some of the conspiracy theory communities was rather 40 plus. So it's definitely not a topic that's just concerning young people. And here we really need to work on improving digital literacy, but also digital civil courage, where people are brave enough to also intervene when they see that someone is becoming the target of a hate attack or that someone is spreading disinformation online. And better intervention programs are also much needed. There's a lot that we can learn from offline de-radicalization models that we can apply to some of these online extremist spaces. And we've piloted a few projects here at ISD, but again, this is really we're just at the very beginning of trying to counter the spread of hate and disinformation and radicalization. So every initiative that goes into that direction, I think is really helpful and valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for this perhaps a bit unsettling, but definitely insightful overview about what you have researched. So before entering the discussion, I would like to give the two other panelists somehow the possibility also to add some additional viewpoints, so to say, to the discussion. And I would like first Andreas.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, thank you, Julia, for this, well, inspiring and, well, admittedly somewhat worrying talk. If one looks at these, well, dark corners of the internet, which one sometimes hopes are farther away than they than actually turn out to be. Maybe for my contribution, I would like to shift the perspective a little bit, because I think what we've seen right now is some of the patterns of behaviors in specific groups, or the emergence of these, well, counterpublics, if one likes. But I think what's also important, if we think about the internet or the role of digital media larger as as an impact on society, I think it's also important that we have to look on the systems level a little bit, or on the larger societal perspective where this fits in. So so maybe for one, it's interesting to reflect that that we've started talking about this a little bit in the run-up to the election of Donald Trump. And after that, the worries connected with the internet or digital media have basically skyrocketed. And I think it's no surprise that we do so in the context of the political developments that we have seen in the US. Because in the US we have, I mean, it's the biggest and the loudest political sphere that we have. So it's no surprise that we're looking at that. But I think also that the United States is a very, very specific political entity. So we see there undoubtedly among the politically engaged, or among the partisans, among the elites, a polarization that takes place, so that the Democrats move farther away from the Republicans, and that we see both on the side of the Democrats and on the Republicans that there are further, well, even more radical fringes that push them further apart. And this is no surprise, because if you look at that, you see that elites for a very, very long time, and especially here Republican elites, have been pushing well, the limits of political discourse, have worked on destabilizing institutions. For example, think about the distrust that was sought there regarding the accuracy of mainstream media. And what we're seeing there is basically the outcome of a decades-long project in kind of shifting the political ground. And I think, I mean, what's interesting to keep in mind is that if we're looking at surveys that actually survey the whole population, like the Pew surveys sometimes do, you see that even in the US, the seemingly most fractured political society, we see there's still a lot of common ground among people who are not necessarily strongly politically active, or who are strongly politically interested. So what we're seeing there is that in society at large, there's still a lot of opportunity to find common ground and to move policy along. But I think once we turn our view online, and once we look at what online discourse is all about, there we see the partisans, there we see the really, really engaged individuals who are there, and who are kind of pushing the online debate, and media and politicians are looking at them, listening to them, and adapting their own agenda to that. So I would argue what is happening online is a little bit of biasing of the overall political discourse, and a listening to, or making visible, probably the most politically active or the most political engaged people, which then shifts the overall, or risks shifting the overall agenda or discussion. And I think that's also important to keep in mind if we're thinking about the alt-right or the far right in the US. There's also a game played there: who is the most extreme, to then make it into the media. So once you realize that by doing something extreme, saying something extreme, by performing an extreme political identity, that you then have the chance on the one hand being maybe even heard by politicians, but also being covered by the media. So there we're seeing that that this drives potentially this radicalization, of what we feel as a radicalization in online discourse, might also be a driver of. So not necessarily the actual the actual convictions or the actual attitudes of people, but we see that as an instrumental use of this, of getting attention and capitalizing on this. And this is, of course, also a danger. I think this is also very well adapted to the US media system, which is highly commercial, where you have a lot of space for broadcasters who focus on political fringe groups or partisans. So that allows you to get on those broadcasters and get into the program that way. If we're looking at Germany, for example, there we see a public broadcasting system that proves much more robust towards this. So which also has to deal with challenges and figure out what legitimate challenge or which space to give legitimate challenges in the political sphere, but overall has been much more disciplined with regard to what to focus there. So if we're thinking about the role of digital media and the excesses of digital media, I think we should be careful in contextualizing what we're seeing in the US to the very, very specific situation, political situation that we're having there, and also to the strategic choices of political elites in how to deal with online environments, and also with regard to the media choices of how to deal with that and how to contextualize with that. And I think what we're seeing there is probably less of a deterministically kind of technologically driven radicalization or kind of destruction of democratic discourse, but we see more of kind of very contingent choices that have been made where people probably wrongly think they can profit from this in political competition. So I think that is something to keep in mind. What's also, I think, is important to keep in mind if we're talking in these discussions often about something like disinformation or information bubbles that people move when they're online. I think what is important there is also to keep in mind, yes, there are spaces online where you find homogeneous or environments of homogeneous political information, but people not exclusively move in those. So they dip maybe into an exclusively conservative or liberal Reddit group, but then they're also consuming mass media, or they're also consuming media of the opposition side. So it's not necessarily the case that there is this, if we look at that empirically, it's not necessarily the case that we find these really isolated individuals who only see the information coming from their side, but we have politically interested people who move through different information environments with different characteristics, some of them healthy, some of them not so healthy. But it's definitely, I would argue, not the case that we see these global echo chambers or filter bubbles emerging if you're looking at some of the literature out there. So that is maybe also something where some of the threats or the fear of the internet might be slightly might make for a good narrative, but is not necessarily kind of well driven by once you look at the data or at the phenomenon. If you look at the larger picture, not only focus on the use of specific channels or specific groups. Also, I think what is important to keep in mind there, if we're thinking about something like this disinformation, there's often, yes, we see that people kind of subscribe to some of these views. But if you look careful at some of these larger surveys, you feel or you see that the reach of these sources is by far not so large as we sometimes fear. And also then once you start looking closely at the individuals who are holding these information, I think Julia already pointed to some of the findings there. We actually find people who are already having a political identity or partisan identity. And yes, they're sharing this information or disinformation on Facebook, but then do not necessarily do so out of kind of informational motive. So this is an information that is absolutely true that you need to share, but they also do that from some sort of performance of their partisan identity. So which is not necessarily a question of information quality, what we're looking here, but more about a partisan conflict and the role that holding these views then move into that. And there's been great research on that by psychologists, so Hugo Messier or Michael Wang-Petersen have done really interesting studies into the motives of sharing or holding these identities. And again, it's not so much that people are manipulated in into a worldview that they do not share. It's more like that they already have that availability or that readiness to move in that, and then use that piece of information as a pretense to show off this identity, or also to provoke others. This does not make it more nice if we see it, and that, or make it less problematic. But if we think about it that way, it already shows that we actually have to move beyond the question of is it on Facebook or is it not on Facebook, but we have to move to the motives that lie behind this, and the political identities that are driving this. And I think that is an important maybe final point to end with. I think all over the world we are right now in, or for years, we're in situations where political conflict looms large. So we're discussing major social changes that are on the horizon, or that we're actually experiencing. And it's absolutely no surprise that we see societies kind of politicize around these challenges and around these changes that are coming down the pipeline. And I think the danger that we're currently seeing is if we tend to discuss any sort of deviance, as we have also seen in the context of COVID, any sort of deviance of the common view, of the common sense, as something kind of a misguided view, somebody who has been manipulated in something, we somehow kind of shift the grounds of political conflict, because we're basically at the end of the day saying, look, here's the majority, this is what the majority thinks is right, here's what the government thinks is right, and we have to do this because actually experts are telling us, because there's statistical models behind this, and you have to follow this. And people who are then getting the feeling, okay, look, I'm feeling uncertain, things are changing, I'm not profiting from this goes against my interests, but I find no representation of this sort of doubt, or of this challenge of the majority opinion, and to then move online and express this, or exchange views around this. I think if we move too far in kind of judging this as deviant or kind of misinformation and disinformation, we lose sight we lose sight and the ability to intervene with groups in society who basically do not share the political convictions or the political goals that they perceive are pursued without alternatives. And I think some of the discourse that we're having about manipulation online, controlling information environments, sometimes brings the risk in maybe over-regulating or over-controlling in that, and kind of moderating away a conflict which actually is in a society, in which actually societies would have to face politically and actually contest openly. Because I would argue most of the things that are challenged actually have very good reasons, and it could be defended in a very valid way. So maybe to close, I think it is important that we're seeing that the digital transformation of the digital environment that we're seeing is a very, very important part of the public sphere, or the public arena in the current in the current moment. And of course, these infrastructures are shaping the way political discussions are held. The media is working, political elites are acting, and collective action is organized. So we have to take them seriously, and we have to look at what is happening there. But at the same time, I think we shouldn't fall for the danger of overemphasizing these examples of deviance and these troubling examples that we're seeing. But if we want to then talk about this as a societal phenomenon or societal issue, we actually have to get data and contextualize what is actually happening here. And I think then we can have a maybe more relaxed and maybe also more helpful discussion about this topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And before entering the discussion, I also would like to add Philipp's perspective.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Julia, for this presentation of the rather dark corners of the internet. And also thank you, Andreas, for giving this systems perspective, which I very much share and think it's important. So I think, yeah, you have even touched on many points that I also would like to second. There's an issue of representation, I think, which should be discussed and can be discussed. Also an overrepresentation of, let's say, some of these problematic movements that gets picked up by the media. So I would even go further into the systemic view and think about who are the actors and who is in which kind of incentive structure. I think here there is definitely disruption happening, and if this is good or bad is, so to say, an open question. And I think it's actually the wrong question, so to say. So I would like to direct, and that's also because I'm trying to move into this direction with my research, towards a different question. Instead of asking, okay, digitalization is happening, is it good or bad? We have to find the final decision and then make a judgment if we keep it or not, because we don't have this decision to make, because it will be here with us and probably will stay. So I think it's rather useful to ask, how do we want it to be? And who should be the actors in that, and who should be represented and or overrepresented? But of course, this doesn't work without understanding the existing dynamics. And I'm very fascinated about the question, what are the actual causal connections? Besides, yeah, there is maybe a rise in polarization or politicization, but it's of course another step to causally link that to digitalization, or let's say the rise of social media. And then it becomes very difficult, and one has to look very closely, because there are of course many other big things happening around in the world that can be related to that, as you pointed out correctly. However, I don't think that the, so to say, null hypothesis, at least from what I'm reading from the literature, is true, that there is no effect. So I would say there are effects, but I think they can go in either direction, and that's heavily depending on the political situation of the country, for example, where it happens, but also the platform itself can have a very different dynamics or effects. So I think sometimes radicalization and empowerment can, I mean, maybe it sounds weird, but can be something like the two sides of the same coin, where a group that feels underrepresented reaches to a visibility, which is sometimes good and sometimes maybe not, and we have to make tough decisions here, I think. But I totally believe that we are seeing a big change in the way the public sphere works, from increasingly from one-to-many communication to this many-to-many communication, increasingly self-organized discourse, and to come up with rules for that. That's what I'm trying to do also in the future. And there where I disagree a little, that we might not run into the danger of over-regulating too quickly, because I feel, maybe I'm not seeing these, but that in the last decade or so there was quite a development rather unregulated, and now the regulation is picking up, which is, I think, good. However, coming up with useful rules, I think, will be the tough challenge, because we cannot apply the rules we have. I mean, maybe some concepts from public broadcasting or so can be transferred also in the digital world, but many other things, especially when it's about the social interactions, and that's also why social media is so interesting, they will have to be different and new. And I think that's the challenge we are facing, and I would like to look at this.
Thank you, Philipp. Yeah, so for entering the discussion, I would like to start with a question to Julia. So Philipp said already something about or suspicion, or somehow a feeling about overrepresentation. So somehow that the stories that you told us might be somehow not representative for the social media or the internet as a whole. And so basically my question would be, what do you think, what can we learn from your research and from your insights about also social media and the functioning of social media as a whole? And the background for this question is also, you mentioned QAnon, and I could add Querdenken here in Germany as movements that somehow entered the mainstream and have contents which is, if one is not a believer or if one is an outsider, it's hard to understand that somehow sane adult people somehow believe these things. And so one question would be, could somehow your research and your insights help in understanding these phenomena?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, it's true definitely that a lot of what I've also shown in my presentation is probably not representative of society as a whole. But I would say that I think we need to study both the more mainstreamed polarizing discussions where we see rising polarization levels along different topics that are really carving out these dividing lines in our society, and some of them were mentioned by the previous speakers. But I think climate change is one big such topic, but also feminism, anti-feminism, and of course racism, or also some of the progressive movements, Black Lives Matter versus the more extremist movement, White Lives Matter. And so it's really interesting, I think, to understand those. And of course, what I've been doing in my research is more look into the really extreme manifestations of that, and look into the most extremist hidden corners, which are not representative of society as a whole, but which are definitely the continuation of that. If we play that out into, say, a thought experiment for the future, I do see a scenario where we have such rising levels of polarization that we end up in two very extremist chambers, basically, or in two very extremist bubbles. Although, as I think it was Andreas Jungherr who mentioned that some of the research shows that actually the phenomenon of echo chambers is really disputed, and it's a question of whether we are really within those information bubbles or echo chambers of like-minded people, or whether this is all a myth and we're actually anyways in a much more open open discourse forum online. I do think that it's something where we need research looking at both dynamics, both the mainstreaming of polarization or mainstreaming of radical ideologies, and also at some of the really fringe phenomena to understand where we might be headed in the worst case. I hope that was.
I just wanted to wait if there are immediate reactions from the others.
May I jump in here and say that I totally agree that with these questions, it's very important to also look into the future, because things are changing quick, and maybe we cannot afford to overlook such developments because they are potentially non-reversible. Once we are divided, as you describing this scenario, then it might be very difficult to come back. So I think super interesting, and I wanted to ask you were touching on prevention, of course. So also what I'm researching is mainly focusing on people who are not yet somewhere where we might not be able to reach them. And I think the pathways to these groups is important and interesting. And that's, I think, an important area of research. And also, of course, to look at the long-term trends, if they are growing, if they are shrinking, or if they are, if you have just this constant level of crazy people in the society. So that's, I think, something where we should and could look at, and rather be early than too late.
Yeah, I absolutely agree on the pathways question. I do think it's very important to understand also what different communities online serve as gateways into these more radical fringe communities or subcultures.
But before entering, so to say, the therapy question, I would still stay a bit at the diagnosis, and in particular with respect to to the polarization question, to which extent society is really as polarized as it might sometimes appear when you look at social media. So in particular, we as in this computational social science field, we very often look at Twitter. And Twitter seems to be a very specific medium to see polarization. So Twitter seems to be sometimes much more polarized than perhaps what you get from surveys. So this is basically also a question to Andreas, what he can say about that. To which extent is this? Yeah, what could be? What is the real picture? So.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting. I mean, you're pointing out that one is often looking at Twitter, and then one uses the concept of polarization of then saying, look, there's a distribution, and it has two poles, so this must be a polarization, which from a distributional perspective is correct. But then the question is, what does that mean for society at large? And I think, I mean, there's always that thing with digital trace data that they document a very, very specific slice of behavior, and I would often take issue with that we can reliably infer attitudes based on these traces, and instead that we see basically communicative behavior. And if you're speaking of Twitter, for example, you see that retweet networks tend to be polarized. mentions networks not so much. So we're seeing that there's different behavior, and with different behavior, there's different kind of cross-partisan engagement. So maybe we learn more by these studies about the communicative behavior on these platforms than the inference that we then sometimes draw on the society level. And also, I think, I mean, I think there you see the benefit of these much more focused ethnographic studies that Julia also presented, because there you're of course much more closer to the actual thing, or to the person, or to the performance of the person in the space, than by simply looking at the traces that they leave and then building these large scale patterns. So I think that is some of the risk of these large scale data-driven approaches, that is much more difficult to interpret what we're seeing. But I think maybe one other point regarding polarization, it's an interesting thing, because we are, polarization is something that like an American obsession also, that if you look at the literature, at least since the 1980s, they're worried about polarization and drifting apart, and of course each time it's much worse than before. And I think there's something there within the nature of the US discourse, that has these two camps that then always feel to be in conflict, and each generation experiences a new, much worse conflict than the generation before, which I think is always also kind of a memory loss function that we're experiencing there. But the interesting thing is, research-wise, I think we are right now in a situation where we very often look in the US, or to the US, because they are the most innovative studies that are out there. They are the most dramatic cases. If you research those cases, your chances are high to be published in a highly ranked journal. So our collective imagination drifts to that area of the world, and I think there's a risk by then kind of looking at that and transposing what we're seeing there, or transposing the expectations developed there into our own societies. And I'm not necessarily sure that the concept of polarization works if you're thinking of the German political system, where we usually have the most intensive fight is about who's in the middle most. And so I'm not necessarily sure that by applying these concepts, who are very, very specific to specific contexts in others, in other international areas, and then also apply them rather haphazardly to digital traces where we're not necessarily sure what they mean to begin with, that this is the most that is the most robust way of drawing inferences on society.
Yeah, so we have now talked about the one pole, so the radicalization part, the polarization part, I just also wanted to raise again the question about the democratization part. So these original hopes at the beginning of the rise of the internet that this kind of new communication tools will lead to more transparency, to more informed citizens, and to more participation, because somehow it's easier to access, it's a better way. Yeah, more people can participate on communication. And today the media discourse, or if you think about this docus on Netflix or whatever, so they mainly are focused on the dangers and on the threats by this development. So still I would like to hear your opinion about what is about these original hopes, what is about this original potential. Do you think this is still there and we can somehow develop it, or somehow it is over and we have to say, okay, we have digital detox and we have to go away from it? So I don't know who will start. Philipp?
Just as a quick response, is also what I meant in my first statement. I think this digital detox or these, backward movements, they will neither work nor, I think, are they somehow useful, because the potential is there, and you're right, there were early hopes. Then somehow now we are in a very negative picture, and we might be biased, as Andreas points out, by the US and the developments there, which might be specific. When I looked through the literature, I actually found more papers than I thought also about other countries, other cultural contexts where, for example, the effects can be positive, and for example, political participation can be increased. However, I'm not sure if this picture is wrong, that we are now seeing it more negative. I think rather maybe there's a development happening, because it has been 10, 15 years. And in the beginning, the internet, at least in my opinion, was less commercialized than it is now. And I think the power of platforms cannot be emphasized enough here. So I think it can be done, and it should be done. And it's actually, there's probably a huge room of possibilities that we are not even thinking about yet, how we can do democratic decision-making online. But we are doing it in a, I don't know, I like to make this comparison. We are trying to do that in a shopping mall or so. And the rules are also not made for that. So there, I think, might also be even if it's not, so to say, intentionally implemented, but as a collateral damage, I think some of the phenomena we are observing might be part of that development.
Julia, you want to add something?
Yeah, I would say, I completely agree. I think there are a lot of solutions that can be, that can make use of this democratization of knowledge and also of political participation, especially thinking about also progressive movements like Fridays for Future. We really see that this has led to some really positive online forms of online mobilization and connectivity, or even the Baltic Elves, which are fighting Russian disinformation, for example. There you really see that. There you really see that, it can be almost a crowd-funded initiative that can also fight disinformation or can fight hatred, like also the initiative in Germany, Ich bin hier, which essentially copied the Swedish, I think, original, I forgot what the original is called in Swedish, but really fighting hatred and hate campaigns online, where you can make use of this bigger international participation of what I would call is digital citizenship. One of the problems, and that I think also was raised by Andreas, is that we're now, I think, seeing this polarized debate that we have in the US, we've had in the US for such a long time, also come increasingly to European countries. I would say we almost face something like an Americanization of political discourse in Europe, because we're increasingly going towards two poles, although we have a very different political system in countries like Germany or the UK than from the US, but we're seeing the same dynamics, that we're having these poles that are drifting further apart. yeah, and I think that in that regard, unfortunately, this utopian idea of social media is connecting us, and the internet is giving rise to a democratization of knowledge has unfortunately rather backfired, and we're seeing more exclusive communities being formed, and instead of just the democratization of knowledge, we're seeing the spread of disinformation because of the rise of citizen journalism, which is in general a good thing, but can also be misused. So I think that's one of the risks.
I think it's interesting because, I mean, if you look back to the early literature, I mean, if you look at for example somebody like Manuel Castells, who says, well, look at the digital technology. Digital technology will lead to challenge of institutions. And in that regard, which is a very democratic project, because you're basically, if you're thinking, I mean, the interesting thing, the qualities of democracy that we were pointing out were rather abstract versions of democracy, or very institutionalized versions of democracy. So if you go back to democracy as such, as a concept, democracy is actually the competition between different political groups in society. And I think what we're seeing right now is that this democratization, or this element of democracy, the fight for political alternatives and the fight against institutions, is exactly what was prognosticated in the beginning. In the beginning, we were just kind of having the Western arrogance that was basically saying, look, our institutions are perfect, so we won't be challenged. So actually only authoritarian countries will be challenged, or only backward countries will be challenged, or only conservative values will be challenged, because those are restrictive institutions that the people will push against. And in the first wave, we actually saw that. But what we're seeing right now is that also the institutions of Western democracy, the media system, quality information, kind of a shared space, or shared sense of political rules of competition, those are actually also being challenged from within. So actually, I would argue we are seeing exactly what in the beginning was prognosticated, or what was said, that is the mechanism that is rolling out. But we're now seeing that this is much more applicable than was thought back then. And we're seeing that it's not necessarily clear that that the cosmopolitan, academic, highly educated view or people will be using these tools exclusively to challenge the institutions with which they have a problem. Right now, we see that through this commercialization of the place, actually access has been expanded massively, and that means that other people are starting to challenge institutions that they don't agree with. And I think that the surprise that is happening from the, if you like, educated elite or so is, oh, the others are also here, and they can use this as well. And this is then when we start talking about controlling this a little bit more, and keeping the place a little nicer and a little more ordered.
Philipp?
May I just respond to that, because I see this danger, and for example, European researchers thinking that it's a great thing that some groups in other authoritarian countries get empowered, while when we see similar thing happening here, we feel this is a problematic development. This is, and maybe that's what I meant with the two sides of the same coin, definitely a danger. However, I think we cannot assume that this democratization will just happen without any rules and I don't know, guidelines, because we were talking just before about misrepresentation, and representation is one of the cornerstones. So that I mean, I'm not a political scientist, but I would believe that representation is something that's important for democracy to work. And that is something that I don't see necessarily implemented anywhere or being even on the agenda, so to say. And then of course the factual correctness. So I mean, it's nice that there is something being empowered in a movement and people being heard that have not been heard before. But if, of course, let's say their demands are based on actually really factually wrong information, then we have a problem as well, because then we cannot respect that. Or then we might have a problem in the future, at least. So I'm just saying, I don't think it will happen alone and by itself. And that's the same argument that when someone says like there was TV and people panicked, and there were books and people panicked, that's true. But I think also then people sat down and thought about these systems, and they are becoming increasingly complex and increasingly relevant for democracies. So I think there's also increasingly effort necessary to keep it in the democratic boundaries.
I think, I agree totally that we have to take seriously what is happening and then to react. So it's I think it's not feasible and it's not sensible to simply celebrate any challenge that is out there. So I think it's important, and I think some of the, I would argue, we have over the last 20 or 30 years, at least in Europe, we have a little bit lost the sense of political competition, at least from the center or from the liberal democratic perspective, because everything was going quite well and there was no necessity of engaging with that. And like Julia pointed out, there was no necessity for counter speech because I wasn't experiencing all this radicalization or this opposition in my life, and so I lost a little bit of the skill of doing that, or the idea of that. And similar with the regulators. So we're dealing with a broadcasting system. This has been rather stable. So we have some rules that are there, and we have a few actors that are actually in the same country. It's easy to regulate that. And I think that some of the challenges that you're pointing out and that you were pointing out in your presentation before is actually, how do we think through what to demand of these platforms? What is their democratic role? And I think that is a very, very necessary approach, and it's also necessary that the European Union engages with this. But I would rest a little bit easier if my impression wouldn't be that a lot of that is driven by the fear of disinformation or the propaganda of disinformation, and a little bit more from that there was a little bit more of an effort in actually getting a sense of what is actually happening, instead of starting with the diagnosis that disinformation is destroying European democracies and therefore the Americans should pay more tax. And I think there's where my worry regarding some of the regulatory efforts are coming from. But there should be rules, and I think it's also good to not leave those rules to the platforms themselves, because that will be, original but not necessarily helpful.
And just one sentence to that, because I am all up for evidence-based regulation policies, and I think we are at the moment in this process, and we have to do that, and us researchers have exactly that responsibility to deliver that evidence and to say where are the interesting and important things where we have to regulate. However, in this current situation, I just want to point out another difficulty that increases the power of platforms even a little bit further, is that they also control data access. And I mean, we all know that. When you say we have this disinformation problem, and it might be inflated in the scientific, but mainly also in the popular discussion, then better data would probably help us a lot with clarifying these things and looking at that on a systems level and say, how big is the problem? And that's very much lacking, and that feels sometimes very tedious to try to keep up with that.
Okay, so that I can only agree with this last statement, and I found that there is some consensus that somehow we cannot reverse the digitalization, that there's still some potential or some still hidden potential, so to say, also in these new technologies, that old institutions decay, but that liberal democracy in particular needs then also new institutions for the social media, and or other, I don't know if you should call it institutions, or other ways somehow to help to bear this potential. And therefore I would like to ask whether you have, what are your ideas, or what are the directions in which you think we should look and go to do that, to build this new institution. So in our project, we were quite modest somehow, simply thinking about what we called not only to observe debates, but also trying to start to build tools to facilitate debates. But this is really only a very small step, and just I think one could already think bigger, even if we are not yet there. So just I would like to hear your ideas. I don't know if Philipp wants to start, or Julia.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good starting point to merge data analysis and really quantitative analysis of what we're seeing online, and as was mentioned earlier, and deep dives that really go into the ethnographics of it and really study the behavior in more detail then, because yeah, by combining the quantitative insights with the qualitative insights, I think that can be the basis of then informing policymakers, but also starting a debate on what needs to be done on a regulatory level, also from the side of tech platforms, what can we realistically demand from them or ask them to do? Because I do think that there's still a major potential to really deal with the fact that we are seeing that extremist content or incredible content like conspiracy myths are being still promoted by the tech platforms, are still given priority by the algorithms. And in order to really understand how we can change that from a regulatory perspective, I do think we need more analysis. Also how these radicalization engines, as we both call them, are working exactly. And then I think, yeah, we have to base this advice or these recommendations on the research. And I think there's also a need to constantly update the research, because of course the vocabulary and the behavior and the dynamics online change on a daily basis sometimes, or at least on a weekly or monthly basis. So there's also a strong need for real-time analysis that can inform policymakers of the latest trends.
If I may respond also to this dynamic situation, I think that's a big problem for regulation that I've now mentioned several times, which is, I think, necessary and good, and it has to be done very wisely to not be outdated in another 5 years or so. So that's, I think, a big challenge. Also, I said that in my talk this afternoon, that it's difficult to regulate every detail, how platforms work and function. Then I think there is a pathway towards competition, so where we facilitate better competition, and then platforms could have an advantage that are, let's say, promoting factual correct information, because I trust that people actually want that. At least that's what they say in surveys. So that's another way. And then my, let's say, maybe fantasizing even further in the future could be to when it will stay difficult to work with platforms, and if their incentive structure doesn't change, and we cannot change it by regulation or by even maybe by the consumer side, which is also another way to change the incentive structure. But if this all fails, I think another way is also to build public platforms. I mean, that's maybe a bit of a step. But as we have public broadcasting, I think it's also thinkable, at least, that we have publicly funded platforms that serve similar purposes to connect people or to distribute information. And they are not based on this incentive structure and economic model. But then, of course, we need people to build them. We need also the data and the research that goes now in the real platforms, and I mean, this is a very powerful engine that they are running, and I think building this from public hands is quite a big project.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the interesting thing is that probably the conflicts that we're experiencing right now are probably a mild preview of the coming social conflicts. So if you're thinking about conflicts around climate change, once that becomes a distributional issue, and once political parties start this, or decide that this is a topic that they actually want to politicize and to polarize the society around, then I think we have a major challenge with regard to getting information out that people are trusting. So I think something that we have to think about is how do we, on the one hand, re-establish some of the trust in media, or how do we establish trust or keep the trust? So keep the trust in a public broadcasting system, keep the trust in information that is coming through platforms by establishing rules that we can then be sure of, but also to then kind of do so broadly by actually having competing views on these media. So that is not the case that we're basically looking at one-sided information, or that these infrastructures can be challenged as being politically, or as being political, or as kind of having the thumb on the scales and pushing the debate to specific areas, but actually to be neutral arbiters of information. I know that in the US, this position is getting less and less popular, but I think there's a danger in actually demanding of media infrastructure to become arbiters of political conflict. And I think, yes, we're in need of rules, and yes, we have to figure out how to signal the reliability of information, but also we should keep in mind that we actually need the trust in institutions, we need the trust in media infrastructures, we need the trust in science also, as being interested in facts and presenting that. And I think that will be a major challenge to keep that, or to reestablish the value of this. Because I think everybody, or a lot of people in academia, have currently a sense of crisis or social crisis that they have to engage with, that they have to take part in the conflict that is that they see raging. But I think there might be, I mean, the long tail risk of this might be much more damaging to media and to the discourse than the short-term win of having a soundbite out there supporting one policy or another. So I think that is a major challenge, to keep that right and to keep the balance there.
Yeah. So before entering a last round directly with the panel, I already wanted to remind the listeners so on Zoom that you can write questions in the chat, and our audience on YouTube that you can write it on Twitter using the hashtag ODYCCEUS21. Yeah, so the last round of questions was around exactly what Andreas already addressed at the end of his statement. It's about our role in the whole process. So, and our role in particular, if I reflect what we did in the project, it's already not only one role. So first, we are scientists, so we're trying to make science about these phenomena. So we try to establish a scientific knowledge about it. And already there, it's not so clear. There's also debates about what is the best role to do that. So whether somehow a more classical idea of being a neutral observer, or whether also it's possible to be, so to say, engaged and even on the activist side somehow to think about it, you do something for a better world, can be, so to say, a role. But there's also a second role in at least portion, as it lies in our project. We are also something like engineers, so we're building tools. So we're doing things that then can change how people can use social media. And clearly we have some ideas and we want to do it for the good, so to say. But at the end, we cannot control who's using these tools. So, and there is a problem that I see is also that we don't yet have the methods really to be able also to reflect on this part. So to understand because somehow we're still researching what is the effect of these social media technologies on political discourse and society. And at the same time, we're already changing this technology and building new technology. So this is also, I think there's also a problem there. And finally, we are also part of it. So at the moment, we are broadcasting is on YouTube, we are on Twitter. Some people also have experienced outrage on Twitter, and I think Julia probably knows a lot about it. So basically, because we are researching society, there are also reactions from this side. So how you reflect and how you see yourself, so to say, in this whole field, and how you see your role there. Who will start?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, it is a really difficult one. I think it's very tricky. I think for me, I'm wearing several hats, of course. I'm wearing the hat of the researcher at Oxford University and the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, but I'm also wearing another hat as an investigative journalist and author, where I do more, where I go deeper into the movements and also meet the people and directly speak to them. And I think that makes me more prone, to on the one hand, to even being radicalized myself. I found myself, when I entered the female misogynist channels, really at the verge of actually being quite vulnerable myself to some of the narratives that I found there, which I had never thought I would be, but I was, because we all have moments of also vulnerability and moments of weakness where we do tend to take a political side if we want it or not, and sometimes even to empathize or even sympathize with what we're studying. So those were really moments where I could see that actually I'm more sometimes than just the researcher self. I'm also sometimes, at risk of being radicalized myself. And I think that's also why I started to strongly believe that there's no profile for radicalization. But I do think that it's important, and that was mentioned already, but that it's important for, especially for the academic sphere, to remain neutral overall, and so that we do our best to not on the one hand over politicize our research, and also not humiliate anyone, not give, in any case, I mean, the ethics procedures are strong enough at most universities and academic institutions to prevent that from happening, but to never name individuals' names, or to never also depict individuals rather than groups in a negative light. I do think there is a strong argument to be made against humiliation, because we saw what the media, to some extent, by the hyper-sensationalization of some of the extremist protests or extremist trolling campaigns, by giving them such a big platform on the one hand, but also by sometimes humiliating people who took part in some of the far-right protests, they moved even further away from the mainstream, and they were even more prone to being further radicalized. And that can be very counterproductive. So I'd be really cautious about, also communicating research findings to the media, which sometimes, of course, uses the best headlines. And I think my book was an example of this to some extent as well, because, of course, it is a catchy title to go undercover with movements, but it's then also in our hands, in the researchers' hands, that this is not instrumentalized or exploited by the media just for their own clicks and viewer numbers. And because otherwise, as Andreas said, I think we lose the credibility in the long term. So it's always rather the long game that is, I would say, more important than the short gains that can be made from this. But it's in the US on some campuses, the dialogue or the academic discourse is already so hyper-polarized that it's almost impossible to find researchers who are not on one side or the other. And that makes it increasingly challenging in the future to really assure that people believe in academic findings as being neutral, as being facts that are not necessarily political in any sense.
Philipp?
One of, so directly connecting to this, one nice sentence of a political science paper, one of the classics about polarization. I'm sure you know this line. It says, the discussion about polarization is in itself polarized. And I find this really funny, because you just pointed to the scientific debate being polarized. And I think we have to be careful when we use these tools and we engage, but even if we do not even the scientific process itself can become more fall prey for these incentive structures. Of course, we know we also have currencies, which is citations, and of course also attention. And I think there is a real danger that we, driven by Google Scholar or Twitter, move further into this business, and that there's a responsibility of stick to the facts and not use the catch. That's true. And then of course, yeah, we can talk about trust. However, I find, especially in this topic, more than on the descriptive or quantitative research, but now when I was developing further, like in interventions, I find it more difficult to stay totally unpolitical, because this is, of course, and I mean, a political scientist might know this better, automatically also a political question, because many of the interventions or things that we are working on, they either have an underlying picture of human nature or how society should look like. So there are normative questions connected to that. So there is also, I feel sometimes, the necessity to take a stance. And that's why I think at least I partly also became more of a political activist, at least when it comes to inform or lobby for evidence-based regulation, for example. So I think that's also maybe an important role that scientists can play, is being lobbyists for science, because there are many other lobbyists around there. So just as a counterweight.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I think that goes with the challenges that society face, and once one engages in research that is closely engaged with current social phenomena, then I think there's always that thing. One is part of society. One is probably a political being, and also kind of the engagement with facts and with research in a specific area convinces you that specific outcomes are the right ones, and that should be pushed in that direction. So I think there's a legitimate position to be argued that there's a clearly normative. I mean, that is possible for scientists to have clearly normative positions that they're then bringing out into either in the discourse or into consultancy. But I think the interesting challenge then becomes how to communicate that. So now I'm here arguing from a normative basis that this intervention, I know that interventions work, that is science, and now from a normative perspective, I think this is the right way forward. So we need an intervention that goes in that direction, and this is also sensible to do so. And it's academic to this little play is academic once you talk to politicians, but I think it's important to get a sense of how to position oneself there, because then after all, I think there are a lot of actually political fights coming where it's sensible to have that authority of speaking from a science perspective and not just from an activist perspective. And the question then is, as often as I'm then kind of jumping into the discussion with the full weight of science and my institution behind me, that might then, after repeat offenses, that weight might not count so much anymore. Again, over the long term. So I see that, and I also think that it's important for scientists to engage there. But then I think it's also important to reflect probably one's own role and then engage with that critically. So I don't think it's as clear cut that one can say there's a value-free social science, but I think it's important to reflect that probably in one's work, or be critical in discourse, or accept if one is challenged that. I think the biggest disservice are old. I mean, everybody has these images of deeply engaged social scientists who are out there in talk shows and arguing a strong normative point, finding themselves being challenged on a normative point, and then they draw back on, well, I'm the scientist, what are you talking to me about? So this is then something where one probably also has to reflect one's own discourse power, or power and discourse and behavior in these situations.
Maybe to add to this, I really like the idea, and I think the UK actually sometimes gets it right, because I do think there's a lot of value in having an intermediary between science and the scientific findings that can be communicated by academics who can act as almost ambassadors of science, or ambassadors of fact-based and evidence-based policies, but that can then be picked up, for example, in the UK by the Home Affairs Committee, or by committees that are specifically set up for then informing politics, so that there's almost an intermediary that academics are consulted, but purely on the basis of their research, and then this is translated into policy recommendations by an intermediary committee or institution, sometimes even think tanks, which is, I think, a concept that does, of course, exist in countries like Germany, but is definitely less common than in the UK, or also in the US.
Okay, I think now is the time for questions from the audience. I see already one question here. So Paul is asking, do you think that the rise of extreme viewpoints could also be attributed to the severity of the problems that we face, which seem to only be solvable by more concerted global efforts? For instance, climate catastrophe, refugee crisis, modern slave labor, the increasing influence of lobbyists and giant globe-spanning companies. Who wants to try? So basically, do we see somehow, is polarization or increasing polarization not only a phenomenon of opinion dynamics or technological developments, but really somehow reflection of the severity of the problems that we face? And if this would be the case, then we would expect, as Andreas already said, even more polarization in the future.
Quick answer, yes, definitely. I mean, that these things definitely have an influence, and that's why it's so important, but that's also what scientists try to do, to try to at least come closer to causality and see where correlations can lead us astray. But of course, this is difficult. So I think, yeah, these things.
I would like to challenge your answer, because yes, think about the flood or some other catastrophes which somehow raise a great sense of solidarity and basically would bring people together instead of polarizing them. So if they are really existential threats, then you often observe the opposite. So
a good point, and actually that would be probably what is, or at least at some points, needed for solving some of the problems. On the other hand, maybe Andreas would say also what is needed is a competition and of ideas, for example. But okay, I see. Yes, the trigger point can be something outside an external event, but then the dynamics can of course be influenced by the technology where then this discourse is taking place, for example. So yeah.
I think, maybe one thing that is interesting there that Hugo Messier is pointing out when he talks about disinformation, and he says that, well, there's basically no cost involved for you to hold a wrong opinion on climate change right now. So the bigger the problems are, and the more global the problems are, the more risk there is of these narratives that are out there, because actually there is no incentive for getting things right. If there's a flood around the corner, then first of all, I know what I have to do to protect my house, to protect my family, to protect my neighbors. And there's actually a high premium of getting things right in this situation. Regarding even if you're thinking about COVID, which for many people has been rather an academic threat that they just heard about in the television and were told by the government not to go out anymore. Even in that situation, for many people, there probably wasn't a premium of getting things right. So so conspiracy theories or wrong ideas can take place. So I would argue, yes, the larger the problem and the smaller my own contribution to the solving of the problem, I think the more at risk you are at these kind of really polarizing and kind of these epic stories about good versus evil, or that are there because actually the challenge of doing something is too big, and I feel helpless, and so I fall back on these kind of make cake stories that are out there.
I would agree. I think one of the interesting dynamics we can observe throughout history is that during times of crisis, we actually see polarization rise and anti-minority hatred rise and conspiracy theories rise. And my initial reaction to COVID was also, maybe this could be an opportunity for all of us to come together and actually face a common struggle and decrease polarization. But in the end, and the climate crisis could be the same, but in the end, it actually massively increased, as I showed in the presentation, anti-Semitic hatred, or in general, anti-minority hatred and polarization levels. If we look back at the plague in the 14th century, there was already the narrative that Jews were poisoning wells. Or if we look at times of cholera, there was the idea that doctors were trying to harvest organs and were actually, again, there was disinformation that was being spread. Or even in the economic crisis of 1929, we had a massive rise of anti-Semitism and conspiracy theories linked to that. Or I should probably say conspiracy myths. I always, since we're the Institute of Mathematics, I shouldn't use the word theory in connection with conspiracy myths. But I do think it's not, of course, the internet alone that has made it so severe. It is just the nature of severe crisis to see higher polarization, but the internet has really enabled players who want to exploit that for their own gains, who want to see radical changes in the power structures and in the in the even democratic institutions, and who are against any form of establishment institutions, whether that's the media, academic institutions, private sector, or governmental institutions.
And maybe, I mean, just to add on this, it's actually definitely doesn't seem particularly resilient, these systems, against such crises, and they are much bigger maybe ahead of us. So actually taking the more optimistic point of view and saying, so we should be smarter than 1918 or even further back in history, and we have these technological means, maybe we can do better in the future and become more collective intelligence than being a polarized fighting mob.
Yeah, there's directly a question related to that. So we have talked before somehow about that we also need new institutions, and you said somehow new measures, and Peter asks, do you see awareness among politicians for the need of more rules for the platforms? And do politicians, to your experience, see a chance to implement such rules? So yeah, perhaps also Philipp can say something about the European level. I don't know if there was any reaction or what the status of this report is, but also perhaps Julia can say something about that.
Yeah, just quickly, I mean, the DSA is well underway, and there's the Democracy Action Plan is another big initiative. I think on the European level, there seems to be quite a motivation.
DSA is what?
Digital Services Act, and then there's the Digital Markets Act, and they seem quite ambitious. And also our report, for example, was received well. So yeah, on a European level, I have hopes. Maybe also because they're not as directly involved in the daily basis of elections or so. I'm not sure if this plays a role, but I'm slightly optimistic here.
I agree that I think there's a lot, there's a raising level of awareness, and also of governments really taking action on this matter. I do think that Germany led the way in introducing the NetzDG legislation and the anti-hate speech laws. But of course, other countries will follow. There is more resistance in some of the governments, which means that there are less political incentives to introduce more rigorous rules for the platforms, especially in the US. There's just too much value put on freedom of speech versus hate speech is just, deprioritized under the freedom of speech. In Germany, we would see this is exactly the opposite side of the debate. And then there are some countries that sit somewhere in between, where the UK and other European countries have started to really think about policies. And France has, I believe, already introduced a form of anti-hate speech legislation and is fighting disinformation. So yeah, we're seeing some progress, but the problem is that they don't yet tackle the roots of the problem, which is the business models of the tech firms. And that's I would say the main problem, that we always see a bit of a cat and mouse game in removing content, removing extremist content that doesn't really tackle the root of the problem.
Okay, so then now the question is coming in. It was at the beginning a bit slow, but now we have a lot. So Armin is asking, also related to the role of science. So when we develop tools and observatories, we sometimes face the question of potential misuse by, for instance, extremist actors. And for example, the very first time that our tool, it means the Twitter Explorer, for the exploration of Twitter networks was hyperlinked online, it was on a somewhat shady website that related it to a potential use for doxing. So how we can, as scientists and tool builders, strike this balance between keeping our tools open source and preventing them from being misused?
It's maybe I can say something about this, because I've often faced this question also in our research when we even think about whether we should blur the names of screenshots that we share in reports, or again, using databases. To what extent should we make that available for other researchers? I think the answer lies in very limited use that has protected access for selected people who apply to use the database for their research. So if you have a protected database where you only send the link with a password to a person who proves that they are doing a research project at an academic institution or at a renowned think tank for research purposes and not for any political purposes or any form of exploitation or potential for harassment. I would say that's really important, and that's something we also at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue have been thinking about for a long time, because we also use a lot of data analytics and social listening tools, where of course you get data that would also not really be reconcilable with the EU data protection laws anymore.
I was just yesterday at a workshop touching on this tension, especially between, as you also said, open data and ethical use of that. And I think, at least when it comes to the usage of data and informed consent, for example, and how to collect this data when developing experiments, then I think we should draw the line exactly there to be different than the platforms, because I see a danger also that researchers suddenly become or do in the end the same thing as a platform does, and there it's a fine line, and ethics standards have to be updated and developed further, because some of them don't apply anymore. I see big loopholes there. Because often the IRB standards stem from the situation where participants come into a lab, but now we can develop tools that just scrape data from somewhere without people knowing. And I think that's an important discussion to have. Where does the researcher stop and provide real informed consent?
Okay, so there are at the moment 3 more questions. So I have the plan to stop at 10. So please, so if you have more questions, then perhaps you should write it that we can answer it. So Tom Willard is asking what specific narratives or types of language warrant more attention from researchers? Which technologies or methods might be operationalized or developed further to analyze these? So Tom is from the ODYCCEUS project, and he's exactly doing this kind of analysis. So he just asked what would be of specific interest from your perspective.
I think, I mean, there are some obvious points. I mean, on the method. I mean, I'm not sure that there are specific narratives that I would now focus on. Probably more areas of contention or kind of focus points there. I think, I mean, regarding method development, I think there is still a lot to be done with kind of developing natural language processing tools, which not kind of just reduce the language into small bits and make it very abstract and comparable, but also to be stronger with regard to meaning. Then there's always the thing that well, Google already did that, now we have BERT and everything is solved. I think, I mean, the thing there is that this works only for very, very large data sets, and I'm not necessarily sure that this applies to much of realistic research environment. So I think there's a lot to be done with regard to method development that is running not on big data but on biggish data maybe, that we more usually encounter, and that is able to identify these more meaningful elements in language, and not just kind of the highly abstract versions that we're seeing right now. And then I think, I mean, the next clear frontier is how to deal with images, how to deal with sound, how to deal with video, because I think that a lot of the tension that we're now having, at least in political science, on text as data, all that is well and good, but if we're moving into that online discourse environment, we see that a lot. I mean, text is only a part of what is happening there. The information is much more enriched, and then I think there we're also completely lacking procedures who allow collection and scale, and then also what type of questions to ask of images, for example. I think that is an interesting way forward of conceptualizing these types of objects that we now can analyze, but don't necessarily have a handle on it yet, methodologically and also theoretically.
Yeah, maybe to add to this, the MIT Media Lab has developed some really interesting tools, or is developing really interesting tools in terms of visuals, or analyzing visuals and analyzing memes, for example, which, as you say, are really important to understand, especially communication campaigns in the context of the international far right or the alt-right. And in terms of language, I think researchers like Tim Squirrel at Amsterdam University from the Open Source Intelligence Project, or alt-right Open Source Intelligence Project, I believe it's called, they have identified, for example, vocabulary that's being used in different online extremist communities, which of course constantly have to be updated, but that could be a really interesting starting point for further analysis. And then, for example, looking at word clouds that are associated with these terms identified by them, and then you can go further on from there, I think.
At least part of this group, I think, as also in our project. So we had also this work in the conference.
Brilliant.
And yeah, so there's the question. There are two further questions. Oh, there's another one. Three. I think then let's take the next one. Sven Barnish is asking where different groups benefit from social media to get into public attention, some good and some bad. What kind of rules can we think of, given that the underlying mechanisms and dynamics are similar? So it's a bit related to this normative question, and how open can things be done? And if you want to, I think very often somehow requests for regulation are made on the basis of examples from one side, and there might be always collateral damages, so to say, of these regulations that are not thought of, or that are not in the public attention. So I think this is related to this question.
Maybe just quickly, because I was touching on this, I think, during the discussion, talking about the two sides of the same coin, what is good or bad when it comes to a, for example, minority group coming to the spotlight. We might judge this very differently, and it might not only be an absolute judgment, but it can be that other people see that as a bad development and others as a good one. So I would just try to adhere, as I said before, to the principles of representation. So if this group actually is, I mean, a minority, of course, can never be a majority, so by definition, so they should be represented in a way that we agree on, and not overrepresented, and at the same time groups shouldn't be underrepresented. And that's of course a different and in that sense unsatisfying answer, but I think this is one criterion, and then maybe their ideas and their arguments should be open for, you know, exchange and criticism, and if they survive that, then I think it's fine for this movement to gain traction, and that's why they also need to be, for example, factually correct, which is something that they need to be able to be challenged, and I think that's sometimes not necessarily the case when they can do this in a space where they are not necessarily challenged by the rest of the public, for example.
I agree that you could draw the line where there is a systematic use of disinformation, and a lot of the fringe groups that we're talking about are of course making use of that, versus if you use factually correct information. I think that's a legitimate movement that can, of course, make use of the dynamics on social media in whichever way they want. I would say maybe ads-based communication campaigns are a different area to think about, because of course there you would need to at least have full transparency if that serves political goals, and especially if it's backed by political parties, which is already the case on Facebook. But for any other activist groups, let's say, I do think as long as they're factually grounded and evidence-based, present evidence-based information, I think that's a very legitimate cause, versus if you have climate change deniers or conspiracy myths that are being spread, or extremist groups that just twist statistics, or make use maybe also of forbidden symbols like swastikas, then I think that is where you can draw the line. But that's an ongoing debate, I guess, and it's really hard to, it's really hard to give an absolute definition of what should be banned and what shouldn't.
There is one question that is more directed to Andreas. I think it's from Emily de Colinar. There seems to be an increasing distinction of American political culture, legislations, and platforms from European political traditions and policies. How can we make this distinction more explicit, especially under the pressure or urgency to recognize the universal nature of American social issues?
I think, I mean, if we're thinking about legislation or of the governance of the platforms there, I think the points that Philipp was making, and the strength of European governance approaches there, I think their European perspectives become very clear. And also, if you look at the way that the NetzDG was done, I think educated some of the platforms of the specifics of German sensibilities and the German legislation there. And I would imagine that there's some sort of internal learning process engaged with this. I think also if you're research focused regarding policy and governance there, I think there's a very strong tradition also of comparative projects, and also there's a space for international perspectives. I think once you move more into the quantitative arena, and once you move more in the computational social science arena, then I think things become a little bit more difficult, because that community is small to begin with. And then I think, I mean, the leading edge of that research is in the US. And I think one then has to attract the interest of these communities there. But I feel, at least in the political science community, in the communication community, there's an increasing awareness of the need for comparative projects, and there's a space to go there. This being said, I think that is what you also point out regarding the universal nature of American social issues. I think there's a danger that we are also as researchers and also with students, that we simply pick up on the narratives that we're seeing coming from the US over here. We see that in the media coverage, that these cleavages that are in the US undoubtedly there are then simply translated and into other contexts. And I think that is a much more difficult process of getting free of this, because it means that you have to do more to think through what the actual issues are. So, for me, it would be very easy to talk about the fundamental cleavages in the US politics right now. I would have a much harder issue to do that on the same level for German politics, which is absurd. But I think which kind of reflects the state of our thinking, the state of prior work or prior art that has been done. So there is always the risk that you have to think through more. You have to do more original work because the community is much more smaller, focusing on these issues. And once you move outside of the West, then things become, of course, much more interesting, but also much more difficult in doing that prior work, and then to also communicate why this is relevant. But I think also, thanks for the Trump moment and thanks for the increasing myopia of US-based colleagues, I think the case has been much more clearer, because that is a pain felt by a lot of scholars, that there's an implicit expectation of basically copying the concepts and the cleavages from the US to another context, and I think that makes it easier to make the case why diversity is more important.
By the way, this is another task I think is looming the horizon, is to come up with a concept if we want, and I said we want that, and maybe we actually want the rules. And the question is then, do they need to be, how local should they be, for example? So we have the Netz.de in Germany. So do we need to develop rules for social media that is actually a global phenomenon, and that's super interesting about it. But do we need to adapt all these rules in the specific political and cultural contexts, which would make the task even harder? So I find this fascinating, and I think there needs to be much more research going beyond, so to say, like the weird problem in psychological research, often where the sample is often taken from a weird sample. We also have to look at how social media works in other cultures and what their specifics are.
That's
now it's almost it's already 10. So and there was still one open question, and perhaps we can do this as a last round of short answers if you have the idea for it. So Felix asked, research attention focus on course very pressing negative examples of the effect of technology on public discourse, but what cases platforms could serve as positive examples? What can we learn from them? So to give somehow a positive end the whole discussion. So
I would say Wikipedia and LinkedIn are examples of really positive platforms. Wikipedia is great. You have, on the one hand, you have a control instance where you have not citizen journalism, but you have a citizen-based, or crowd-based knowledge platform where everyone can edit and comment and add their own information. But then you have a control instance that then decides, is this really backed up by facts? And this works really well. And LinkedIn, I think, is another form of social network that actually has a surprisingly low number of extremist content of any form of, but that's because it serves, of course, a very professional purpose. Although I've heard that it's sometimes also being used as a dating platform by some people, but it primarily serves, of course, a professional purpose. And you can't really, or it's harder to set up a LinkedIn account that is fake, or at least it doesn't really make any sense, because yeah, in the end, you want to impress the people around you. I don't know what that tells us about LinkedIn. I think for Wikipedia, it's clear that it makes sense to have something that's crowd-based, but at the same time with some form of checks and balance system. But for LinkedIn, I still wonder how that could be translated into a recommendation for Facebook or for Twitter or for other platforms.
I think, I mean, what is also interesting, I mean, there was, I mean, if you're looking at some a little bit of the earlier work that was looking at online communities, self-help communities regarding health issues, I think that there's a lot of research to be done that is focusing on these much more local issues, but where there's real empowerment going on among groups, and also some sort of validation. There's been a very interesting study by Yannis Theocharis about Twitter use during the Greek financial crisis to organize substitute teachers. So these are then very, very small, I mean, smallish issues or smallish topics, but where you then see that communities can use these tools quite effectively to actually create social capital or use it in civic society. And I think the shame is that that these stories are much more harder to communicate or to get people interested in. After all, it's substitute teachers, so well, what do I care about this? This is about the death of democracy. This must be important. So I think the thread makes it sometimes more is more nearer is the topic that collects a lot of attention. But I think there are a lot of studies out there on the fringes that are focusing more on these local issues that are about empowerment of local communities. And I think that is something very, very interesting. And there's a lot of potential there to connect that or to theorize this more thoroughly.
I just heard that in India, WhatsApp was very effectively used for to self-organize the social support system during the COVID crisis where the government failed. It's a story that a positive example I heard. And I want to second the case of Wikipedia, which might also have its roots in that it is not a commercial entity so far, and hopefully won't be. So yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think we are now a bit over time, but at the end of a quite interesting journey. And I want to thank you for discussing with me all these things. And I want to thank the audience and also the people who ask questions. And yeah, thank you, everybody, and have a good night.